Margarita Chopenko. The First Test. The air was soft. A light breeze shook the tall grass stalks, silvery in the moonlight. A boy, about 10 years old, was walking across the field. Soon, the path crept down a slope and dissolved into a riverbank. At this place, the water was without much movement because the river was bending. He stopped. It was quiet, and there was the sharp scent of mint. He went to the water, scooped it up with his palms, and washed his hot cheeks. The wind pleasantly cooled his face. The whole riverbank was covered with high reeds. The boy looked through the darkness for a place where the reeds were less dense. It was a barely noticeable path. He took off his shoes, his trousers, and, holding them all in one hand, took a wary step into the water. Groping for the first stone beneath the water, he found without haste the correct position for his foot on it, and began to move slowly. The stones were smooth, overgrown with moss, but it was possible to pass through them if you moved with caution. He knew and did not hurry. It was not far to go. A boat was hidden in the reeds. He climbed into it, put on his trousers and shoes, untied the rope securing it, and pushed off with an oar. Over the water, a pre-dawn fog had already begun to spread. "I will never forgive Kostya," Nick thought resentfully, and began to row. Soon he reached the center of the river, and the boat, picked up from its calm current, rushed forward. Nick lifted the oars out of the water, pulled them over the edge of the boat, and relaxed his back. Now that he was alone and could rest a little, he remembered the grinning, arrogant face of his brother. An icy wave of rage burned his stomach and rolled up to his throat. Why was Kostya like this? Why did he take what was so important to Nick? For what reason did he grab it, take it away? He stole it and gave it to others to abuse. His wooden toy boat, which his grandfather had started crafting, but couldn't finish because World War II started. Nick asked him not to touch it. It was a special boat, almost a sailboat, a schooner. Nick remembered how once, before the war, in May of 1941, relatives from the city gave his friend Stefan a toy boat. Nick liked it very much and said so to his grandfather. His grandfather said that he and Nick would build the same boat themselves, and it would be ready by his birthday on August 8th, when Nick would be 7 years old. The next day, his grandfather brought the half-piece of linden wood, chopped lengthwise, and said to him, "Do you see this log? It is not a log, it is a schooner!" Then, using different carpentry tools, his grandfather shaved down the edges and corners so that the tree began to change shape, and finally it became clear that it was the bottom of a large toy boat not less than 2 feet long, with a wide bottom and curved edges along the bow and stern. Nick was very fond of listening to his grandfather when he talked about how he served in the Black Sea Fleet in the First World War, and how blue the Black Sea was, with its white curls of dense waves. And Nick always thought that when he grew up, he and his grandfather would definitely go to the Black Sea, and of course they would ride on a real ship. As the flow of the river became more intense, Nick took the oars in his hands. He knew that soon the river would split in two and flow around several large stones located near each other like family. This place was beautiful, and he always liked to sail here when he was on his way to his grandmother's house, which was located on the same bank but further downstream. In this place, both banks of the river were high and stony, with overgrown bushes and trees towering behind them. An unexpected narrow path descended between the stones directly to the water. Here he once saw a deer drinking water. The deer noticed them passing by and turned to watch them as they drifted down the river. Indeed, Nick never sailed alone, always with his brother Kostya, who was 4 years older than him, or with his mother. Last time it was on Easter. They sailed on Saturday, all three of them, him, his mother, and Kostya, to visit their grandmother. Rounding the big stones, the water raged, and the boat began to pull to the right. He was afraid of this place. Would he have enough strength to deal with this course alone, without Kostya? At the thought of his brother, he was struck by a wave of anger. He pushed the right paddle harder than he should have, and pulled water into the boat over the edge. Then everything happened unexpectedly quickly and badly. The water gurgled around him. Nick tried to keep the boat in the middle, but the water currents fought each other, carrying the boat to the right and then to the left. In rounding one rock, the water crashed into the side of the boat hard and pushed the edge of the boat so that water poured into it. Nick feared that it would capsize. It came very close. It was a miracle that he escaped this predicament. Perhaps thanks to the lightness of the boat. It leapt onward and was now drifting port side forward. Lost in his thoughts, he did not even notice that the wind had picked up along the movement of the river, and the current had become even faster. Nick panicked, realizing that the boat might have been about to spin out, or even capsize, or collide with those stones ahead. The water darkened with its depth. A few tragic scenes from his grandfather's stories about accidents on the water ran through his head, and he feared for his life. He had already envisioned himself slowly sinking under the water into green-brown seaweed. Heart pounding, tears spilled. He could not hold the boat. "Grandpa!" he shouted in fright. But there was nobody and nothing around, only roiling water. The boat was being carried sideways toward the rocks. If it spun any more, it would turn backwards. The worst possible situation. Instinctively, as though it was a lifeline, he grabbed the left oar and plunged it vertically into the water. Nick held it in both hands with all his strength. At the same time, he bent his legs and tucked them under the bench he was sitting on so as not to upset the boat's balance. The boat shuddered as it bumped into this obstacle. For a moment, it froze, then jerked sharply to the left, skirting the oar. Nick quickly pulled the oar out of the water and began to row to the middle of the river. There were several streams here, but they were much milder. The water skirted the rocks, and the boat righted itself and skirted them too. Now, Nick was looking ahead again, and both banks were in the right place, to the right and to the left. His heart beat happily. It was not so bad. The boat again began to pull slightly to the right, but Nick no longer made any sudden movements, having understood his mistake, and only raked the water slightly with the oars. The water became smoother. He had passed this threshold. The morning sun rose and began to burn his left cheek. Nick just now noticed that the day was already in full swing. He thought that at home his mother should have already returned from her night shift and would be walking in the yard, feeding their dog and cat. She always feeds them first, before the family sat down for breakfast. Remembering breakfast, he felt hungry. His mother would probably be frying eggs or cooking porridge. His heart was pierced by an unpleasant thought. She will soon realize that he is missing. Maybe she had already realized. He felt sorry for his mother. He had even stopped rowing, but the boat immediately began to drift to the side. He needed to think, but he could not think and row at the same time. The fuse of anger that pulled him out of the house and compelled him to ride this boat had subsided, but his resentment for Kostya remained. Kostya doesn't like grandfather, he thought. He doesn't care whether he returns from the war or not. Nick remembered how his grandfather left home when he went to the front lines in the middle of July of 1941. His grandma packed his things for the road and cried. His grandfather, tall, sturdy, tanned, hugged Nick and said that he was sorry that he had not finished the schooner, but that he would finish it when he returned from the war, saying that it should be soon. He hugged his wife tightly and kissed her cheeks, wet from tears. She saw him off to war, again, the second one. He was 47 years old. Then he hugged everyone in turn, threw his bag over his shoulder, and went out into the yard. He called the dog over, squatted beside him, patted his head, said something to him, and sat for a moment looking away. He got up, straightened his belt with his right hand, pulled himself to his full height as if he wanted to touch the sky with his head, sighed with a full breast, threw his head back, and closed his eyes. Everyone stood near the house and looked at him as though they were enchanted. No one said a word. Turning, he went out of the courtyard, looking at them one last time, or rather through them, as if they were no longer there, or he was no longer there, or it was no longer him. 3 years have passed since then, 3 full years. They sometimes received letters from grandfather that were folded into paper triangles. grandmother waited for the postman every day, and everyone else waited too. In each house in their village, they were waiting for these paper triangles, and they were happy whenever someone received one, and they read these letters to the whole village. But everyone was afraid to receive a letter in an envelope. This letter could only be an official death notice, which they called funeral letters, or at best a notice that the soldier was missing in action, which at least gave hope that he might still be alive. Nick loved his grandfather very much. He always knew that his grandfather knew everything in the world, and that he would teach him everything too. This may have been in part because Nick's father was almost never at home. He worked on a geological research expedition in the mountains of the Urals. They went into the taiga for many months, from early spring to late autumn. Nick's mother waited for his father the whole time and told him and Kostya that their father would soon return from the expedition and that they will do this or that. The expedition stopped work and returned for a winter holiday when the ground was frozen and they could not work. Then his father was home, and almost every day they had many guests. His mother set the table, and his father would tell stories about the forest, about wild animals, about all sorts of interesting cases, and Nick listened with everyone together and thought that this big and handsome man was a hero and his father. But he did not really have any affection for him. For example, Nick remembered the hands of his grandfather, which were always busy all the time, but he did not remember the hands of his father. Usually, in February, his father began to prepare equipment for the next expedition, and in March they would leave for the training camps. And so it went on until July of 1941, when he urgently returned from the expedition and went to the front line, 2 weeks after Nick's grandfather. He was 34 years old. Soon, his mother received a triangle from him, where he wrote that they had been transferred closer to the front and were forming divisions and conducting military training. A few months later, an official letter arrived in an envelope which made his mother faint. It was a funeral letter. The whole village cried. From then on, the funeral letters came often, and the sound of women crying spread from one side of the village to the other. And it seemed that there would be no end to it. Wives lost their husbands, mothers lost their sons, and children lost their fathers. The memory of his mother crossed his belly like a whip. Nick was not running from her, he was leaving his brother, Kostya. He again recalled the events of yesterday, when Kostya asked him where the schooner was. Nick thought that Kostya wanted to look at it, and went with him to the barn. He took it out of a secret place, so beautiful, so large, with curved edges made of wood that had not yet been painted. They had looked at it only a minute when Varka, Kostya's friend, stepped into the barn along with 2 more boys who had not long ago arrived from the city for the summer. One of them said, "And what is this, another log?" He grabbed the schooner by the stern, looked at it appraisingly for a few seconds, and, waving it in his hand, ran away. The whole gang ran after him. Nick, as the youngest of them all, followed last. He wanted to grab it out of his hands, but he could not reach when the other boy raised it above his head. Another boy jumped and grabbed the other end of the schooner. Nick, with a sinking heart, watched powerlessly. And Kostya? He should have smacked this insolent boy in the face. They were the same height and age. But instead he was kicking the grass and fiddling with some trinket that apparently this boy had given him in exchange for the schooner. "You traitor!" Nick shouted at him, his cheeks burning, and, with clenched fists, attacked his brother. Kostya just pushed him with a slight movement of his hand, and Nick fell into the grass. At that moment, Nick decided that he would leave the house forever and ever. First to his grandmother's, and then, maybe, to the front. Nick imagined how surprised his grandmother would be when she saw him. Her house was located in a small settlement consisting of 12 houses, located on a plain at the base of a high hill and at a fair distance from the riverbank, because in the spring, when the snow in the mountains melted and rushed in numerous streams down the slopes overflowing the river, the water rose higher and flooded its sloping bank. The houses were wooden, built from pine logs, with roofs covered by pine boards. Such a house was very warm and durable. Pine trees are naturally saturated with sulfur, which disinfects the air around and resists the rotting of logs and boards. Nick remembered playing hide-and-seek with friends in the early spring, when the winter cold was no longer so fierce. He hid around the corner of the house, and so that he could not be seen, pressed his cheek to the smooth surface of its log wall. He was pleasantly surprised to find that the wall was warm, affectionate. Despite the fact that it was cold, the logs heated up in the sun and exuded warmth. Nick imagined how he would come to his grandmother and see her sitting on a bench under a window of the house, and at her feet, in the grass, her cat, Murka, white with black spots, would surely be lying, purring in the sun. Nick digressed from his thoughts. Yes, he will tell his grandmother everything about the stupid Kostya. Grandmother would understand, advise, maybe even talk to Kostya. His mother had no time to talk to him. The war laid all the burdens of men's work on women, in addition to the regular duties. It was very difficult for everyone, and over the summer it was necessary to mow a lot of hay for livestock for the winter. Women mowed, but they did not have the strength to mow down enough for all the animals. If only they had oats! But all the oats were sent to the horses on the front. Without oats, and with a lack of hay, the horses became weak, and by the end of winter could not stand on their feet. Then the women put them in a sling made of 2 wide leather belts, threaded under the horse's belly and attached to the wall. In this position, the horses stood until spring. They fed them as much as they could, cared for them, and tried to hold out until the new growth of spring, when the life-giving juices of fresh grass quickly restored their strength. Nick thought of all this as he looked at the reeds, which formed a wide strip stretching along the right bank of the river. He was looking for the place where he was supposed to dock. He remembered well that when they went to visit their grandmother on Easter in April, there was a large, prominent stone on the shore. But now, in the middle of July, no such stone was visible. Nick panicked, realizing that the reeds had grown and hidden the stone. The river made a prolonged turn to the left, and its right bank was far beyond the reeds. Nick sailed on, peering into this green density, trying to discern the outlines of the stone. But nothing was visible. He tried to remember how long he had been sailing. The sun had already risen high, but somehow he had not arrived yet. Nick thought that he should be able to recognize this place. It's somewhere here, you just have to look. The movement of the river carried the boat forward. He slowed down, looked around, and sailed forth again. These reeds seemed to have no end. He tried to get through the reeds to the shore a couple of times, but there were no houses on the bank. What to do? Fear clawed at him. He couldn't turn back. He didn't have the strength to sail against the current. He could only sail forward and try to find an approach to the shore. Soon he was convinced that he had precisely sailed past the place where the stone was situated, because the shore suddenly became nearer and higher. Nick fearfully thought that he had never been here before. Suddenly, the reed simply disappeared, and in its place there was a wall of high, steep, rocky coast. It was a completely unfamiliar place, and Nick felt so small, forgotten, and useless. He frantically looked ahead as the river expanded considerably and its current intensified. The boat just rushed into the void of the absent horizon. Now wasn't the time to think. If he hesitated for even a second, he would never get out of this current. Nick pushed the water with his oars, accelerating the movement of the boat to the right, closer to the wall where the sparse remains of reeds were sticking out. After a few strong strokes, he jumped out of the boat into the water, as close to these stems as possible, and tried to grab the large branch of a tree that was tangled and stuck in the reeds. But it slipped out of his hand. The water carried him away. With all his strength, he swam against the current in the direction of the branch, and when he caught up with it, he grabbed the branch with both hands and hung onto it until he could catch his breath. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw his boat as the current freely carried it away, and his heart quivered. Everything was going wrong. But he was still alive. The rushing water was so strong. It wanted to carry him away, and it would take him if he released this branch for even a moment, Nick thought, holding on even tighter. "You must breathe evenly," his grandfather always said. "Water does not like nervousness." Nick took a deep breath several times, trying to settle the beating of his heart. Gathering his thoughts, he pulled himself from one branch to the other until he finally reached the reeds near the shore, dead tired. He hugged an armful of their stems and clung to them, swaying on the water without any strength. Sleep beckoned him. At home, Mama's cooking porridge, he thought, before falling into a deep sleep, but only for a moment. He immediately woke up, coughing and choking on the water, and realized that he had to make his way very quickly to the shore. Clutching at the reeds, he moved to the shore and soon stepped out onto its stony soil. The shore was steep, but a stream ran between the rocks. After having a quick rest, Nick climbed up on trembling legs. He now felt very tired and hungry, but it was necessary to understand where he was and whether his grandmother's house was far away. Going out onto a flat surface, Nick found that this place was completely unfamiliar to him. He stood facing the river, and to the right and to the left of him he saw mountainous projections. Behind him was a small plain, but there weren't any houses on it. Nick decided to go to the left, because he definitely swam further than necessary. Making his way up and down the rocks along the shore, he soon came to a forest and realized that he could not go further lest he get lost in the woods. In addition, here on the stones, people on boats passing along the river could notice him, but against the background of the forest, they would not. Nick chose a higher edge of the bank and settled down to wait. The sun was hot, and as he leaned on the stone and rested his head on the grass, he fell asleep. In a dream, he completely forgot where he was and what was happening to him. Turning, he woke up from the sensation that he was sleeping on something very hard. Nick opened his eyes and bitterly remembered everything. To top it off, the sun was already setting. He did not know whether any boats had sailed by. Maybe he overslept? It was even worse. His thoughts ran wildly when he realized that he would have to spend the night in the forest. Tears came to his eyes, but it was pointless to cry. It was necessary to act. Keeping to the riverbank, Nick headed to the forest. On the way, he came across a currant bush. He greedily began to eat its black, sweet berries. Feeling a little better, Nick continued on his way. He had to find a suitable place to sleep. At the edge of the forest, overlooking the high river's bank, in the tall grass, he found a recess between large stones jutting out of the ground. Under one of these rocks, there was plenty of room for his slim body. Stomping his feet around the stones to scare away the snakes, in case there were any, with hands shaking from weakness, Nick crushed the warm grass under him and curled up on it, ready to sleep. He closed his eyes and thought that his mother was certainly already looking for him. She probably sailed on a boat to his grandmother, and his grandmother would have said that Nick did not come to her, and now they would both worry about where he could be. And his mother would probably cry and say that his father was killed in the war, his grandfather was still fighting, and now he, Nick, disappeared. If Kostya was with them, they would probably ask him what happened. Why did Nick run away? He gloatingly thought that Kostya would have to tell them that he had exchanged his grandfather's toy boat for some kind of stupid badge. Suddenly, in the forest, something cried out. He became alert, turning to lie on his back, stretched out in length. Opening his eyes, he thought fearfully, "What was that?" Then everything calmed down, and suddenly, nearby, he heard the sound of large wings in the grass, a squeak, and strong air vibrations very close. It was a night bird of prey, Nick thought. She had hunted and caught some animal, maybe a hare. He felt sorry for the hare, and at the same time, he thought that his position was not better than a hare. At this time of day, birds of prey and other animals go hunting. He was never in the woods so late, and he became very scared. He had gone fishing with his grandfather in the early morning before, but by that time the predators had already finished hunting and had returned to their homes. But now they were hungry. The forest was filled with night sounds. Somewhere, dry branches crackled, the grass rustled, and small rodents scurried around. Nick lay and listened to these sounds. They were unpleasant, but not dangerous. He was afraid to hear the heavy crackling of boughs, which would have announced that a large animal, such as a bear, an elk, or a boar, was moving through the forest. Of course, these animals usually do not prey on people in the summer, but who knows how things might turn out? Then he remembered that his mother had told him that a lynx had recently appeared in the forest and had attacked a woman. It jumped on her from a branch and simply bit through her neck. From this thought, he again curled up. Something rustled in the grass very close to him. He decided not to think about it. To make time go by faster, I have to count, Nick thought. Now it's probably 10 p.m., about 5 hours until dawn. That means 300 minutes. Just 300 minutes. 300 times 60. It's not that much. He closed his eyes and began to count. 1, 2, 3, 4. He awoke to a sharp sound and froze. A large animal slowly advanced, cracking branches as it moved. It stopped. More branches crackled. This is not a bear, thought Nick. This gait is tougher. Steps were heard closer. They walked in his direction. If only he did not need to breathe. He tried not to breathe, but his heart began to beat so hard that he thought this beast would certainly hear it. Little time had passed. The beast went around the stones to the right from Nick and stopped. Nick raised his head very quietly. In the pre-dawn gloom stood a big, beautiful elk. His strong, heavy horns were held by an even stronger neck. He looked towards the river and sniffed the fresh morning air. Nick admired his strength and beauty, but only for a minute. Something suddenly changed. The elk turned its proud head to the right, stretched its muzzle, sniffed the air a couple of times, then swiftly turned and jumped into the thick of the forest. This puzzled and alerted Nick. What scared him? He thought. Wolves? Can they be dangerous for elk in summer? In the winter, yes, but in the summer, hardly. Now there are lots of hares coming. What could it be? One thing he knew for certain. He would soon see whatever it was himself. No sooner had the footsteps of the retreating elk died away in the forest than Nick heard some distant yelping and howling. It was coming from the right, the direction where Nick had come from. A cold suspicion ran down his spine. These were not wolves. They were jackals. From their voices, he thought there were 6 or 8 of them. Cautiously poking his head out of the grass, he saw that they were running between the forest and the riverbank. Nick felt his teeth chatter from the cold, and the cause was not the cooling of the stones, whose warmth had ceased to heat him. It was fear. He was always afraid of these wild half-wolves from which there is no escape. They will surround you, and you will not be able to get out of their circle. If you run, they will rush after you, and there will be no escape from their wild pack. It was a true disaster. Even if they are well fed, they will not let you out. And who knows why they do it, or what they need. He could not escape from them. He knew that for sure. They would find him, sniff him out. But what could he do? Only the direction of the wind could help. If the wind blows from the river, they could not smell him and would pass by, Nick thought, hopefully. But the pack was approaching. He felt a severe chill. His mouth was dry. He decided to defend himself to the end. He will not be afraid of them. Will not be. Tears of powerlessness and fear reappeared, but he did not notice them. Chills turned into heat. He will wait for now, but when the time comes, yes, like his grandfather. He is there at the front, and these same jackals attack him day and night, and he does not give up, and his father did not give up. His grandfather always said that Nick would grow up and be a real man. That meant his time has come. All these thoughts and images flashed through Nick's head very quickly and heroically, and suddenly, at the very end, he saw the face of his mother, and that he himself was to blame for all of this, which might become tragedy. And it was so stupid. Nick did not have time to think this through to the end, as 2 jackals separated from the pack, scattered across the clearing, and headed towards Nick's shelter. He saw their shabby muzzles through the tall grass. They were approaching, sniffing the air intently and looking at Nick. Another second, and they would raise their hideous barking, attracting the attention of the entire pack. He had already taken a breath to jump out to meet them, not knowing what to do next, when suddenly, looking over their heads, he saw that on the other side of the clearing, right on the stone shore, a large, ragged tree was growing. He only needed to run across this field. How did he not get this idea before? Time is lost, with annoyance flashed through his head. But Nick abruptly jumped out from cover and, with a cry, rushed towards the tree. From surprise, the 2 jackals jumped aside, and he had the opportunity to run a few meters. The rest of the pack which was earnestly sniffing the grass in the place where the elk had previously stood, froze in surprise for a few seconds. Then, suddenly, as if in slow motion, rushed towards him from his right, as though commanded. Those two who had found him were now circling to his left. "They're trying to surround me," he thought distantly. His feverish gaze spotted a tree branch lying in the grass. He grabbed this branch and, with a wild cry, with a sharp wave in their direction to the left, suddenly threw it at the jackals on the right, so as not to let anyone stand between him and the tree. They all retreated in different directions for a moment. Nick managed to leap ahead a few times. Bending down, he grabbed 2 stones and, with an even wilder cry, threw them at the jackals as well. Fortunately, he hit one of them, who immediately whined, and the whole pack hesitated. But only for a second. Then they all ran after him with even more frenzy. The tree was already close, and its branches were not too high, but the jackals were faster. Their teeth were chattering around his heels, trying to grab hold of his shoes when, at the last moment, from despair, from wild malice, he jumped with all of his strength upwards towards the lowest branch, uncertain that he would reach it. But when he felt its rough surface under the tenacious fingers of his hands, he did not hesitate for a second and immediately threw his right foot over the branch. At this moment, one of the jackals managed to grab the trouser of his left leg, but after hanging for a few seconds, fell off. Having freed himself from it, Nick completely climbed up onto the branch. The jackals clanged their teeth, howled, and jumped, but Nick lay still on the branch, slowly coming to himself, not believing in his salvation. They circled under the tree for a while, whining and starting to bark collectively in their thin voices again and again. But Nick didn't look at them. The rising sun began to get hot, and the pack retreated into the woods. When he had recovered his breath, he moved higher up to a sturdier and more comfortable branch, from which the river was clearly visible. Nick won this fight, the first duel of his life. He would talk about it to his mother, who would find him on the tree in a few hours, and his grandfather, who would return from the war in 3 months due to an injury, and his children and grandchildren. He would not tell Kostya about it, for that night in the forest, he had outgrown Kostya. The whole village was buzzing, telling each other about what happened to Nick, and how heroically he came out of this critical situation. "He has the character of Fyodor Ivanovich," the women said with respect, referring to Nick's grandfather, which Nick was very proud of. And the schooner? Nick would find it abandoned in the grass, and he and his grandfather would carve it out very nicely, paint it, attach 3 red satin sails cut out from an old pillowcase, and Nick would admire it for a long time and let it run along the stream to the general delight and exultation of his friends. October 2018.